Okay, so welcome to the session, everybody. This session is, we've been asked specifically from the CCR to put this session on, and it's basically around applying for NHS ethics, ethical issues, and applying for Health Research Authority or HRA approval. It's something that we do get asked quite a bit, so feel free to ask questions as we go along, or feel free to get in touch with us at CCR if anything sort of comes up after the training that you think of that you want to ask us. So myself and Debbie will be delivering the training. We're both clinical research fellows with the CCR, which is the Centre for Clinical and Care Research. And we're delivering this because we're both clinicians who have experience in research and experience in applying for NHS ethics. So we've been through the process, both of us, sort of fairly recently. And so we're coming at this from a practical point of view. So just a little bit of background first of all, in why is this important, and why do we have ethics? Why do we apply for it? Well, it's about protecting the rights and the dignity and the safety of our research participants, of our patients, and our staff. So it could, because it might not be just patients that we're involved in, it might be NHS staff as well. And it enables the people who are involved in our research to make good, informed decisions on whether or not they want to actually take part in the research, which is really important, that we're not just doing research without consideration of all of those aspects. We need to ensure that everybody's treated fairly and that everyone's given the chance to participate in our research, and that we consider all of the different groups of people who might want to get involved, and that we've thought about any ethical sort of implications that it might have for different sort of diverse groups that we're wanting to research. And it reassures everybody that the research has been through the right processes, that obviously you need to seek that ethical approval. It's the first point of any research, of thinking about what are the ethical implications, what do we need to consider, what do we need to do. And all NHS research adheres to the Declarations of Helsinki, which you will see written in sort of a lot of research papers. You'll see it written in, so if you're doing any sort of qualifications, like a research-based sort of master's or a PhD, you would always want to put in there that this research, it applies, that the Declaration of Helsinki applies to this research, and that you've sort of been bound by those regulations and rules. So often people ask us, what's the difference between REC approval, which is your Research Ethics Committee, and HRA approval? And we've just wanted to talk a little bit about that, and actually the importance of both of these processes. So the Research Ethics Committee is about sort of the rights and well-being of the research participants. And the research ethics committees, there's more than 80 of these committees across the UK. So most regions will have a committee where they review your research proposal, and they review all of your participant paperwork. They review any adverts that you've got. They'll review everything that you've got to do with that research, to make sure that it's ethical and that it meets their standards. And you don't need to choose your local research ethics committee. So, for example, if you had a project, you wouldn't have to choose, a Greater Manchester-based ethics committee. You can go to any ethics committee. And one example of that is, certainly for my PhD research, I applied for ethics, and I found that actually the Greater Manchester Ethics Committees had quite a high waiting list. And I was aware of an ethics committee in Scotland who had quite a shorter waiting list, but also had a lot of experience of approving vision-related research projects. They'd already dealt with a lot of our sort of similar projects on a similar level. So I chose that ethics committee for those two reasons. So for, you know, waiting lists, but also knowing that they'd already dealt with my particular speciality within their ethics committees. So you can pick and choose, or you can just be sort of not selective and say just whichever committee is meeting next, I'm happy for that committee to review it. On a similar note, you might have a committee that you know has given people in your field a particularly difficult time, and you know, you might want to avoid those. But yeah, you don't have to pick your local one. And the ethics committees have lay committee members, so they have people who have lived experiences of some of the conditions that we'll be looking at. The HRA applies to any research taking place in the NHS in England, and this is all about sort of the legal compliance of your research. And in the majority of cases, you will need, you know, certainly if your research involves NHS patients or NHS staff, you will more than likely need approval from the Research Ethics Committee and HRA before starting the research project. But don't be put off by that. It is the same form, it is the same process. It's just that you need those two things in place before you can actually get started. So the very first point of actually looking at what approvals you might need, and whether, you know, first of all, do you even need ethics? Is this research? So the first thing that you need to do is look at, is this actually a research project? So if you go on to the HRA Decisions Toolkit, you can actually use this toolkit to decide whether your project is research. Because if your project is not research and it's, say, an audit or it's service evaluation, it might be that you can go ahead without any ethical approval because you're evaluating an existing service. If it's research, you will need ethics, and this toolkit will help you to decide, first of all, with some really simple yes and no questions, is this project a research project? And that's a really useful starting point. Then once the toolkit has decided, yes, it's definitely research, the next stage of the toolkit is deciding, do you need ethics and what ethical approval do you need? And this, the next stage of the toolkit will again be a step-by-step approach to, yes, this is research, but what ethical approval do I need and what do I need to do that? And this toolkit's brilliant. It will signpost you to other resources that you can look at. It will signpost you to other training packages that you can take part in. So this is your, this is your go-to place for deciding, first of all, is it research? And then secondly, do I actually need an ethical approval? So in terms of what you need to apply for, which we've already talked about briefly, is if any patients or any NHS staff are participants in the research, then you will need REC approval and HRA approval, and that's really a given that you will need HRA approval for anything involving any NHS patients or staff. Obviously, if it's a randomised control trial, you will need the full ethical approval with the REC and HRA approval. And intervention studies as well will need both of those approvals. And it's the same form. So the IRAS form you complete, and you basically can select whether you want to apply for your ethical approval with the REC and with and your HRA approval, and it's all part of the same process right up until the very last stages. And Debbie is going to go through with you in a minute an application form so that you can actually see what the IRAS form looks like. And please do remember that if you're going through this process, that the CCR team are here to support you through this process. So if you've got a project that you want to do and you're just not sure about the ethical approval side of things, please do get in touch and we can help to support you through the process. But hopefully this training will give you a bit of a flavour of, first of all, what do you need? And secondly, how to get started and where to go for support. Another thing to consider is the research sponsor. So all research needs a sponsor, and that doesn't necessarily mean that it needs to have lots of money behind it. The sponsor is the person who will sort of take on the responsibility for the study, the legal responsibilities for the study, not necessarily paying for the research or, providing sort of, a lot of financial support. And you need to have that. And if your research is within NCA, then NCA will likely be your sponsor. It might be that you're doing your project through a university for, say, a qualification, a sort of a master's degree or a PhD, in which case it might be that the university institution is the sponsor of that. And again, if you're not sure, please do seek guidance from CCR or from the Research and Innovation team at Salford Royal, and make contact with the sponsor as soon as possible to let them know that you want to do the research and that you need a sponsor to do that. So before you even start doing this, if NCA is going to be your sponsor, there is a sponsor request application on the R&I site for NCA, and you can request NCA templates. So there is a template for a protocol. So, what should be in a protocol? What should you put in there? There is a template consent form and a patient information sheet. So don't feel that you've got to start this process from the beginning. Use the templates of things that are already there and the forms that are already there. And if NCA is going to be your sponsor, we would strongly encourage that you use all of their templates. If NCA isn't your sponsor, HRA have a whole wealth of resources and templates as well in terms of how to prepare your study documentation. Or it might be that you're with an academic institute like a university who, again, they have their own sponsor sort of templates that they would use. So you seek guidance from whoever your sponsor is going to be, seek guidance on using their own templates and resources, and don't feel that you've got to start this from the beginning. So it's a good idea before you start doing any ethics application to actually do good clinical practice training. And this is an internationally recognised training certificate that you can get, which is all about how clinical research is conducted. It's all about making sure that when we take consent as clinicians, that we're doing that in an ethical and safe way, and that the data that we collect is reliable and ethically sound. And this training is available free of charge from the NIHR website, and it has to be updated, and you will be asked to, when you're doing any research or ethics applications, you will be asked for a GCP certificate. So if this is something that you don't currently have, it literally takes, probably the first time you do it, it probably takes about half a day to, 2 or 3 hours to go through the training, go through the module. And then you can refresh that training every sort of couple of years to get a new certificate. But you should start with this and do the GCP training as soon as possible when you want to apply for ethics for any research. And I'm going to pass over now to Debbie, who is going to actually share with you a live presentation on sort of how to actually complete the form. So I'll pass over to you, Debbie.
Thanks, Claire. Let's have a look. Hopefully it's not logged me out. Let's see. So this is the landing page. So when you're looking for your ethics application, you'll fill in an IRAS form. So this stands for the Integrated Research Application System, and hopefully you can see this landing page. You'll press enter, and it depends whether you've been here before or not, and you'll either be asked to create an account, or for me, I already have an account up and running. And you'll see here on the My Projects page, I have 2 open projects that have now had ethical approval, but I'll open up this more recent one, the taper pane, as an example of what you are dealing with in terms of the request for the IRAS form. What you'd normally start with are your project filter questions, and this will actually enable you to describe your project in terms of creating a short title. So it's just loading up now. I think I'm having a slow internet moment. But the filter questions are really essential for you to determine what kind of project you're doing, who your participants will be. So for me here, I've said it's a questionnaire design study. It will immediately ask you, are you using ionizing radiation, any collection of human tissue samples, and also where the research will be occurring. And as you move further down, it's really wanting to find out, are you recruiting or inviting any vulnerable participants, so children, anyone who's lacking capacity to consent, prisoners. And this will actually, again, help you just to answer those relevant questions to your project. The navigate button is key here. So I use this really often because it's a really large form. So we'll give it a second to take us back to the full form. And what you'll see on here is all of the items that it will ask you to describe your project. And again, it will filter out those irrelevant questions. If we start here at the first items, apologies again, it's going to be slow today. So here you can see it's just asking for a short title, a longer title, details about the chief investigator. But as you move through, the questions become kind of more long and more detailed. So it will start asking about the background, the justification for the project. It will ask all about those key ethical issues, and some of the answers are actually really quite long to complete. You can, as you go, review and print off the whole form, and it's probably about 40 to 50 pages of a PDF by the time you've completed it all. So if I just show you one example of a slightly longer question here. So here we go. So a summary of the main issues. So this is really saying, why are you doing the project? What are your issues around ethics and recruitment? How are you approaching people? What are your inclusion exclusion criteria? If we go back to the navigate page, when you've completed all of the questions in there, you're best off now clicking on the IRAS form. This will show you the whole thing and open up a lot more tabs. If you move on to the checklist, this will then create a long list where you need to upload all of your documents. So you'll need your protocol ready, the CV for the chief investigator, the participant information sheets, letters of invitation, cover letters, reminder letters, postcards. Mine's a questionnaire study, so we've got 3 questionnaires. It will also ask for things like, where's your evidence of funding for the project, if that's relevant, Gantt charts, evidence of good clinical practice as well. So you need to have all of your documents ready, as well as that IRAS form. When you're at that stage, if you then click on the authorization tab, this will then ask you who's authorising this ethics application. So you need to say who your sponsor is. So for me, it's the Northern Care Alliance. I'm the chief investigator. So you send out this request for authorisation. You can see it's gone out, it's been revoked, and it's come back again. And this was actually a good point to highlight, really, because if there's any errors on the form, if you then make any amendments on the form, it requires a new authorisation. When you get to this point and you're ready, then you'll be clicking on the eSubmit tab. And the ethics applications all occur electronically now. When I first set off with my PhD, I remember going to the ethics office with paper versions of everything and doing it manually. But now it's all online. So it will ask you to check your form has been completed. It will ask you, have you uploaded all of your supporting documents, so your protocol, your participant information sheet. Have you then asked for those authorisations? It will then ask you to verify your form, so you have to do that before you can move on, and that will actually check electronically that everything has been completed as needed. At that point, when you're ready, you'll need to book an application for the review, and this has to be done on the same day that you submit your application as well. And what you'll do is you book in and you're allocated you request your research ethics committee, as Claire was saying. Sometimes there is that choice. So you can say, actually, I'd prefer to go to this specific research ethics committee. You'll then be given your REC name, so the research ethics committee name, the reference number and the submission date. And you have to actually go back to your IRAS form and input this on page 1 of the form. That's the only thing you're allowed to change. If you change anything else, it again invalidates the form. You need to ask for authorization again, and only then can you press the e-submit button, and then it will be submitted. And again, if we trace through that process that I went through in December, so I submitted on the 8th of December, and then it goes into a kind of awaiting decision status. And then actually very quickly here, so within 11 days, I had a favourable opinion. And it must be said, this is quicker than some processes. And that's because actually it is just a questionnaire study. And so for me, I was able to have what we call a proportionate review. So you can either have a proportionate review or a full ethical review. The proportionate review is really ideal when you're using questionnaires or something that doesn't involve changing any treatments. It's a non-interventional study, because then the turnaround can be a lot quicker. If I stop sharing that screen and just return to the slides again. So hopefully now you can see my slides. So hopefully that's walked you through one of the IRAS forms. Again, there's a lot of help, as Claire was saying, on the IRAS form itself. There's a button saying help. And also if you turn to the HRA, that's really useful. But if you get stuck, again, reach out to us at the CCR. But just to say, before you start completing the IRAS form, I would get ready all of your study documents first. You need to upload these anyway. But if you start filling in your IRAS form first, the chances are you're going to go back, start thinking about your protocol, revise it, and then have to update your IRAS form again. So have ready your study protocol. That would be the first document. This will really help you to think about the literature, why you're doing the project, what's the justification, what's already known about that project. It will help you to think about your recruitment process, your consent procedure, how you're going to collect the data and what data you're collecting, how you're analysing the data, where you're storing the data, and also it helps you to already map out your timescales. So what time periods have you got for recruitment, for data collection, for data analysis? Again, the IRAS form is going to ask you your study duration. Also get ready then those other documents, so your participant information sheet. This is the document that explains to a participant exactly what's involved if they do consent to being involved in your research. An informed consent form, posters advertising your study, any emails or letters that you need to send to reach out to clinicians to ask them to recruit patients, any other form of adverts, so social media adverts. There might also be some additional documents that you need depending on the type of study and locations where you're going to run your study from. If it is that you're recruiting outside of your sponsor site, so for me, I was recruiting from the NCA, but also other NHS organisations, you might need a local information pack. And this is sent to those external organisations, including an organisation information document. And this will talk that other organisation through the research project and what's expected at each site. And this is required for all non-commercial studies, recruiting from sites external to their sponsor site. You might also need the SOCAT, so the Schedule of Events Cost Attribution tool. And this really shows a breakdown of the costs and the resources needed at each NHS organisation involved in that study. You might also need things like the delegation log. So say for a clinical trial, you'd need to know what responsibilities that principal investigator at each location holds. And here I thought I'd just show some timescales for the taper pain project, just to have that awareness of how long things might take. This was especially slow, so I don't want to put anyone off, but for us, we were thinking about this project before the summer of 2021, but we properly started applying for funding in July 2021. Close by to that timescale, so in that September, I was already asking for sponsorship in principle from the NCA. I knew that the study host would be the NCA, so I wanted the sponsor to know as soon as possible what it was I was planning. Thereafter, I was developing the study protocol with my research team, but also in close communication with the sponsor, and again kept asking them questions. Do you think this is possible? Can we do this? Can we host this from the NCA? So they were already offering informal and more formal reviews. By April 2022, I realised I probably needed more funding. I was massively underfunded on the small project grant I had. So we started applying for more funding. Then I returned back to my study document, started developing the participant information sheet. And it was in the September of 22 that I started populating the IRAS form based on my study document. So by the time I'd refined my study protocol, I then requested a final sponsor review, and they reviewed all of the study documents, the protocol and the IRAS form. So they need everything ready to give that final approval. And then I was ready to submit my IRAS form in December 2022. For me, the turnaround on gaining approvals from the REC and the HRA were quick because of the proportionate review. And then the sponsor had another month to then confirm capacity and capability and to give me the green light to start recruitment. So you can see this process actually does take quite a long time. And I think for me, the slowest part was actually developing the study protocol. For us as a research team, we kept talking about our methods, trying to think, how do we minimise burden on participants, but also on those clinicians that were involved in inviting patients to participate. So we went through an awful lot of rounds of refining the study protocol before then populating the IRAS form. And just to note some other considerations when you're planning your research ethics application and your protocol, you will be asked in the IRAS form, how have you involved patients and public? So have you consulted them in terms of, why is this research important? What do you think we should ask patients about? What data is important? What should we collect? How should we approach patients? You'll also need to consider equality, diversity and inclusion. Are there ways that you can maximise an inclusive approach to recruitment? If that doesn't fit with your research, can you justify why not? So you're explaining that you have considered it, but what your limitations are. If you're including vulnerable participants, what extra measures need to be in place to protect those vulnerable participants? Have you declared all conflicts of interest? What is the participant burden, and what measures can you take to minimise that? So if your research involves patients coming in for samples to be taken, can you link that in with one of their normal appointments? How do you minimise risks, and what will you monitor, and how will you report any adverse effects? Are there any rules about stopping the research? Say if someone has reactions and it starts to be a pattern, at what point do you stop your research to protect patients? Alternatively, if you're doing any interim analyses, what are your keep going rules? When do you say, actually, this research looks like it's finding effective results, let's keep collecting data? What measures will you put in place to maintain confidentiality throughout the whole process? And also, what data are you collecting? What's the most important data that actually you need to analyse without collecting excessive data? So don't collect data for the sake of data's sake. And where are you going to store and archive your data to maintain GDPR? Although it feels like a massive undertaking, it is essential, so you do have to do it. But alongside it being essential, there's some real advantages of preparing this ethics application. For me, it really made me think about every step of the process, from how will I recruit people, how am I going to engage with them, what information am I providing, where am I storing my data, who am I sharing that data with? So it really walks you through that whole process to make sure you've thought about everything. In preparing those documents, say the protocol, you already have done your literature review, you've already got your background and your justification, you've also written your methods. So now for me, when I'm writing to publish, I think I've already got my background and my methods already written. I just need to edit it down so it's suitable for publication. You also have the advantage of your research is then peer reviewed by a different team compared to your research team. And that panel will have variable expertise. It might be that they actually flag up something that could potentially be problematic in your research project and say, we think there might be an issue here. Have you thought about this other method? So it's really good to highlight those problems sooner rather than once you've started your project. And also what you might find is if you're wanting to publish your project, often one of those key requirements is a statement of who's provided ethical approval. Some top tips on gaining ethical approval and surviving the process. Think about it from the start. Think about who your participants are, where are you going to find them? Also think about what's the purpose of the research, why is it important? Also that balance of risk and benefits, and the benefits of research really have to outweigh the risks. In terms of methods, thinking about things like how will you approach people, but also when you're writing your ethical application, write it from the perspective of someone who doesn't know your work, remembering that a third of those research ethics committee members are lay people. In terms of seeking help, please contact us at the CCR. We've included our email address there, so we can help. Your supervisors and mentors obviously are the experts in your field. The R&I team at the NCA are a huge help. So I've been in close communication with them throughout this process to liaise, so they know exactly where I'm up to with the research project. So as the sponsor, they're not surprised suddenly when I'm submitting my ethics thinking we've never read this before. There's also an awful lot of help from the IRAS and HRA websites in terms of providing templates and help buttons. But also for me, I've sent some emails and had really helpful phone call conversations with their HRA who've actually informed my methods and actually described a different way of gaining consent. So that's been really essential. If you are doing that, do keep a copy of all of those emails, because I've been asked to provide evidence of why did you choose this method, and I can say, well, actually, here's the email correspondence with the HRA. They were advising me along this line. And also you can ask the NIHR Clinical Research Network for support, especially if your study is likely to be adopted by the NIHR portfolio. Just as some next steps, so we do run our thinking hubs on the first Wednesday of every alternate month. So if it is that maybe today you're already thinking of a project but not really sure what to do, or you're a bit stuck with ethics, please come along. Those thinking hubs are absolutely intended to be a bit of a sounding board of, oh, I just don't know how to get started, or what, I'm a bit stuck. So do come along and just chat with us. Again, please email us. Feel free to then join the CCR and the R&I mailing list. So Claire Mooney can add you if you contact her. Our next training session will be returning to that concept around, is my project research in greater detail? And we're proposing to host that in July. But we'd also love to hear your views on what we should also be hosting future training on. So do let us know if there's anything in particular that you'd like us to present on. So wishing you every success and just welcoming any questions. So if I, again, stop sharing, so feel free to put forward any questions. And also check in the chat. And I'm so sorry, Claire, you're still on mute.
Sorry, I'm muted. I was just saying, hopefully everybody knows exactly what to do now, and that's why no one's got any questions, because everybody knows what to do with their ethics application. Has any of you got an ethics application sort of coming up, or you know, anything that's concerning you or worrying you in particular?
And I'm really hoping I've not put people off by my time scale. In my defence, submitting another application for funding really slowed us down. So the grant application, but it's I was going to say it's a really good thing to factor in terms of what order everything comes in. There's an awful lot of things that are running along in parallel. So getting the sponsor on board, making sure you can fund the project, and they all do overlap. So once you've started writing your documents, you can extract and use those documents in other ways as well.
I've just thought of a question, actually. The study that me and Gigi are working on, we didn't do the ethics application for that. That was in beforehand. But yeah, we've ended up putting just 2 very minor amendments in, because we slightly tweaked the formatting in a couple of the questions on the questionnaire to help evaluate the blood test we're looking at. But I guess I was just wanting to know a bit more information about amendments and level of amendments, and when you'd apply for them, and things that would be like, yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, no, great question. And actually, that's one thing that we didn't look at on the IRAS form. So when we went to that navigate tool across the top, and it said authorizations and e-submit and checklist, there is also a tab for authorization for amendments. If you visit the HRA and IRAS form, they actually now have an amendment form. So it's an Excel form, and you might have seen it if you've already gone through that process. And actually, it's the same form whether it's a non-substantial amendment or a substantial amendment. I'd work closely with your sponsor with that. So for me, at the moment, I'm currently preparing another amendment, so I'll be filling in this form. If the NCA are your sponsor, then they're brilliant actually at helping you to complete the amendment form, but also then submitting it back to the Research Ethics Committee. So for me, I completed the amendment form. It details exactly what's happening. So what's different? Is it that you're collecting data on 3 occasions rather than 2, or have you updated your participant information sheet, or do you need to store data elsewhere, or whatever the amendment is? but you complete this Excel spreadsheet and then actually your sponsor will help you. And that's the role of the sponsor, because they're taking this overall responsibility. They need to know, right, what's now changed since you first got ethical approval? Is it non-substantial? Is it a substantial amendment? Detail what's changed, and then they'll send it back, and then the Research Ethics Committee will need to approve that after reviewing it, and then they'll send you another letter saying whatever amendment approved. And I think this comes back to the importance of keeping all your documentation really clear. So you'll always have version 1, whatever the date, and then you'll have a version 1 point whatever or 2 when it's been then amended as well. So it's keeping all of that kind of trail of all of your documents and what's changed. But yeah, sometimes it depends on the extent of the amendment as to how fast or slow it is. We had a really minor one, we found an error on one of the documents, and I think we submitted it to the sponsor, they submitted it to the REC, it came back within a day and they said that's fine, it's so minor. If it's larger, then it would take a few weeks, I would imagine.
Yeah, I think it's an important point, isn't it? Just to say that, you know, when you get ethical approval, you're getting approval for everything that you've sent, and any changes whatsoever have to go back through. So it's just being really careful that when you submit originally, that you try and get the paperwork as robust and usable as possible, because if you want to change something, you've got to go through that process. So I think it's a good point to think about amendments.
And I think for me, the protocol is almost like a real strong point of reference, because it's quite a long document. I'm forever thinking, oh, which patients are eligible for the follow-up question, and let me just read the inclusion criteria again. So it really is the thing that you read, you keep reading, everyone on the team needs to be really familiar with as well. So yeah, absolutely keep using that as your point of reference, and just make sure you're using the most up-to-date version. Have you completed your amendment process then? Has it been reviewed and come back?
Yeah, it was actually, because the sponsor is NCA and they filled that form in completely for us.
Oh,
I don't know whether they do that for everybody, or whether it was just with our team. I don't know. And because we were using the same questionnaire for 2 studies, so both of them were turned around within 24 hours.
Yeah.
Even if there was like a couple of different questions, and we turned some of them into a Likert scale and things like that. So it wasn't like just a typo, but because they also requested for track changes, like in the Word document, which I hadn't done, but you can actually. Thank God for Google, because I put in, and you can actually get an old version and the new version and cross-reference them, if anybody needs to know that for when they need all the
I've done that before as changes. Well. learn the hard way.
Yeah,
but it's a good point. Great. If NCA did that form for you, but I think it's worth just making sure that you've got a copy of the form, so that if you needed to do one in the future, that you've got a copy of what was done, so that you sort of learn from the process. Yeah,
they forwarded them to us, so they were really supportive. Yeah,
that's good to know.
And I think perhaps the thing I also didn't mention, once you have ethical approval, you do need to write reports as well. So you need to update the research committee and your funder as to where you're up to. And certainly, when the study ends, you need to fill in a report to say, actually, yep, we finished on time, we finished early, or we've not finished yet, we're going to need an extension. So I think, again, once you have ethical approval, it's keeping in contact, not frequently, but keeping the ethics committee up to speed with where your research project is. So it's a continuous process of having ethical approval, rather than I had it at the start and now I'm kind of gone a bit wayward with it. So yeah. Anything else that anyone wants to ask or say, or any experiences of getting ethical approval?
I've got one more question. Sorry. What's the best grapevine to find out what the best recs are for whatever you're doing? This sounds really useful to know. Yeah. How did you find out?
In terms of which one to go to?
Yeah, like thinking, for example, with the stuff I'm doing for like my PhD, although that was through the university, but that's like more creative co-design processes, which I would imagine some research ethics committees might not get as much as other ones. So
yeah, and it's really about speaking to people who've done similar work. So for example, the research that I was doing was the consent was quite complicated. Because we wanted to be able to assess patients without getting consent, because we wanted to assess every stroke patient that came through the door. And obviously, if you're then asking for consent, you're going to not capture quite a lot of patients who can't sign a consent form. And so there was one particular ethics committee who dealt with that process of consent before. And I knew that from talking to colleagues who'd gone through that process. And so I decided to go back to the same ethics committee and say, you approved this study, I want to use the same consent process. And then because they were aware of it. So it's really just, if you've got any colleagues who are doing similar types of work or in a similar area, or asking around and looking at where and asking people which committee did you go to. And it's not necessary, because every ethics committee will look at things in a similar way, but I think sometimes it can just help to help the process if you go into a committee that has dealt with a particular aspect before. So yeah, really word of mouth, asking around, and it's usually those types of conversations where you can say which ethics committee did you actually go to get that approval.
And I wonder whether you could also get in contact with R&I as well, because you'll be working closely with the sponsor. So at the point that you're saying, I'm going to submit the ethics, the IRAS form, are there any recs to either go for or avoid that you've heard of? You never know, they might have a recent experience of, whatever research ethics committee were really slow, or they really struggled, or they had this strange thing that they wanted from a consent form. So yeah, maybe also ask R&I, because they'll know when you're about to submit as well. And perhaps to add to that, so for me, and I don't know whether you had a similar experience, because I had a proportionate review, because it was a questionnaire study and it happens very quickly, I didn't need to actually attend a meeting with the Research Ethics Committee. But actually, if you go for a full review, you will be invited to join the Ethics Committee meeting. And I've had a couple of experiences of them. Again, pre-pandemic, I attended in person once, so it was a local, it was a Greater Manchester one. And then for the post-pandemic Ethics Committee meeting I was invited to, that was virtual. And it is interesting, actually. They'll ask you things that you think, oh, goodness, I hadn't thought of that, or you hope that you really have, and you've got a really good reason why you've done something. So that in itself can be a really good experience, almost to, again, always think about justifying your methods, why you've done something, why you've included specific people as well. And again, my experience has been quite brief. They've not asked loads and loads. It's not like a PhD Viva. You shouldn't be getting grilled. It's just if there's anything that doesn't seem to quite flow, they might just want to ask you about.
Yeah, they're not there to catch you out, are they? They're there to just make sure that everything's very clear. And if it isn't, then maybe asking you to change the wording, or I've attended both face-to-face and online, and in fact the last one that I did was an online slot, and they just said, we'll call you in if we need you, and they ended up not calling me in because they just approved it without the need to speak to me, and it was really straightforward. So yeah, it does, I think it varies depending on what questions they've got. Lovely. Well, if everybody's if everybody's happy and nobody's got any further questions or anything, we'll close the session. But obviously, please do feel free to get in touch if you want some individual advice on your particular projects and ethics applications, or any aspects of your projects, basically.